thumb, farming should be done when you don't think you're going to be having meaningful impact anywhere else. Now that does not mean that I think you should be farming a lot, it just means that that is kind of like your baseline of what you want to be doing. So whereas farming is good, you will want to be looking for those opportunities where you can apply pressure. This is also quite psychological as well. Not only do I think that is the best strategy for solo queue, but if you're applying pressure, if you're helping your teammates out, then they're going to like you a lot more than if you're a jungler who doesn't leave the jungle too much. So this means that even if you're playing the most farm heavy champion in the game and you don't want to be ganking that much, if you see an opportunity where you can do something, you should be doing it. Of course, on the other hand, you don't want to be prioritizing trying to create plays wherever you can, because those farm junglers tend to not be able to do that too well compared to the other ganking junglers. But what I'm trying to say is that if you think you can do something and you think you can do something with a high success rate, do it. So in theory, that is rather simple, right? You farm until you think you're going to have a successful play, and then you go and make that play. However, of course, in practice, it's a little more complicated. So in this video, what I'm going to try and detail here is how you can identify those situations where you are going to have successful attempts at pressure. When I say pressure, all I really mean by that is anything that either puts your team ahead or puts the enemy team behind. So the first and most important point is judging what lanes will be successful ganks. There are a lot of factors at play here as well. The first being, and probably the most important one, what champion you are playing. Some champions are good at ganking, some not so good at ganking. How you identify what a good ganker is, generally speaking, comes down to three factors. Firstly, crowd control, and that's probably the most important one as well. Secondly, burst damage, how quickly you can kill someone. And thirdly, gap closers. Gap closers is important because it doesn't matter if you have loads of burst damage and great CC, if you can't get up to the enemy, you're not going to be able to take them down. Unless, of course, you're playing with an ally that can set the gank up for you, and that is the second point. Know who your ally is playing as well. Pretty similar points to the ones I just mentioned about who you're playing, but champions that can be easy to gank for will be champions with the CC, with the high damage. Some lanes are a lot harder to gank and therefore will reduce your chances of success. Someone like Vladimir, for example, during the lane phase doesn't have that much damage and has pretty much no CC unless he's on top of someone and he can pull under them. On the other hand, you have someone like Twisted Fate, who's very simple point and click stun, decent damage as well, usually in a mid lane which is quite short, so crowd control is quite important. Those ganks can be quite successful. The last point about judging how you're going to have a successful gank is the susceptibility to the gank that the enemy is. What this really means is what champion they're playing. So if they're playing someone who's very squishy, doesn't have any escapes, those are easier people to kill as well. In addition to that, you also have some in-game factors such as how pushed up their lane is, whether they have their summoners up, how much health they're on, stuff like that. Something which also goes underestimated here is the power of diving. A lot of people will see that the enemy isn't pushed out, they're under their own tower, and they'll assume they can't make a play. But if your ally has particularly high damage, or you've got a particularly high damage, or one of you two is tanky so you can tank up the tower and the enemy is low on health, you can make a dive. Diving is an extremely effective tactic for putting enemy players behind, just to make sure firstly you can do the dive, and secondly you're not going to get counter ganked. You can see how it can be a little hard to identify what is going to be a successful gank on paper and why it's hard to give blanket statements about this, because even if you're playing someone who's terrible at ganking like Shyvana, but your ally is playing someone who's really good at setting you up and the enemy's really low on health, yeah, you can gank that. Now, ganking is probably the biggest part of applying pressure as a jungler, but there are ways you can do it without ganking. All these things are good excuses for you to leave the jungle to stop perma-farming so you can still apply pressure without necessarily getting ganks off. First example is if your ally is in a bit of a pickle in their lane. Maybe they just need you to show your face so you can help them alleviate some of that pressure. Similarly, if the enemy laner has frozen their lane in front of their tower, and basically it means that your ally is going to be in a bit of a shady position in their lane, you can help your ally by helping them push that lane into the tower to break the freeze. Second example is putting down wards and stomping wards. It may seem like quite an obvious example, but vision control is very important. Even if you find yourself never being able to gank, if you never leave your jungle, which is quite rare in games, but say that happens, if you have wards down, you can at least prevent some of the enemy's ganks. So if you think about it, even though you haven't really given any direct impact to your team, by denying the impacts from the enemy team with good vision, you're helping your team out as well. Thirdly is going for objectives like dragon and towers. Dragon is a good one to go and do if you think you can do it safely. Firstly, if you can solo it and you don't think you're going to get collapsed on, go ahead and do it. Secondly, if the enemy mid or bot lane has recalled or they're dead, that is generally speaking a good time to go and try and take that dragon. Reason for that obviously is because you will then have a numbers advantage with your team when the enemy isn't there. Towers are a good one for you to go for if the enemy laner has roamed, but you're not in a position to counter that roam. Instead, you can show up to their lane and push that wave in and then try and take the tower or get some good damage onto it. In addition as well, if you have a laner that's doing really well, it actually is a good idea to take that tower down, because then they can roam quite freely and then they can translate their advantage to your allies. However, I would communicate that with your ally first. You don't just want to show up to their lane and start pushing their wave and then taking their tower if they don't want to roam and they don't want to make that play. You'll just end up with some rather salty teammates, and generally speaking in solo queue, you want to avoid that. The last 2 points are kind of similar, but counter jungling and counter ganking. Now, these are both 2 topics which I could go into a lot of detail about, so I don't really want to cover it in this video. But if you do feel like you have an opportunity to get in the enemy jungle, steal some things freely without risk, or bully the enemy jungle around, you should do that. And with counter ganking, likewise, if you think you know where the enemy jungler is going to show up, and then you can show up in the same